Christina, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Jess, and hello, everyone. If there was such a thing as standing room only for a virtual event, we would be experiencing that today. We have a record number of you who have registered to join us for this topic, responding to conflict from friction to action. And we're glad to welcome you here and hope that you'll be leaving with some strategies for dealing with some of those conflicts or difficult conversations that you're currently experiencing. For those of you who are new to Canadian Management Centre, we'd like to welcome you. We are a national organization that's focused on preparing the next generation of leaders to thrive in tomorrow's marketplace. And for those of you who are CMC clients or have experienced a webinar in the past, we welcome you back. Today's session, we will have some live chatter going on Twitter. So if you are on that social media platform, you can follow us on Twitter at Canadian Management, or you can use the hashtag for today, which is hashtag CMC events, to follow along and join in that live conversation with us. No doubt you will want to have a record of today's session, and great to be able to document some of the key tips that we'll be introducing. So after the session, you will receive an email with a link to a recording of today's webinar that will follow up to you in the next couple of days for those of you who are online today. I am not on my own today. I'm really thrilled to welcome one of our esteemed facilitators with us, Catherine Burdett, who's an experienced speaker and consultant, as well as a Canadian Management Centre facilitator, and she's joining us today from Calgary, Alberta. Catherine brings over 20 years of corporate experience, as well as her experience as an accomplished facilitator and executive coach. And she has expertise in the areas of emotional intelligence, resilience, and communication, which is a trifecta of skills required to be able to navigate and respond to conflict situations. I'm excited to welcome Catherine, and have no doubt that you'll benefit from her expertise today to help us respond more effectively to conflict situations in our lives. So Catherine, without further ado, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Christina, and hello to everyone across the country. It's definitely a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking to a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Why? Because I deal with it in my world every single day, whether it's in personal relationships or in the workplace or with clients that I work with. And what's really interesting is people always say to me, you know, if we could just improve the communication that we have, then things would be a whole lot different. And when I ask them what does that mean to improve communication, most of them say, well, to have the kinds of conversations that we're not having, especially when there's conflict that's present. And it's not that people don't want to have these kinds of conversations, it's just that they don't know how to have the conversations. So today, when we are moving through the content and the conversation, you know, it's really important that we know that many of us are avoiding conflict, and we do it at all costs, which ironically brings with it a very large cost. Or perhaps we're engaging in conflict in inappropriate ways that leave us scratching our heads about what happened, and it also leaves the other person scratching their head wondering what went wrong. In either case, the outcomes are not very satisfying, and we're not really able then to achieve the goals that we set out to achieve, be they personal or professional goals. At the end of the day, we know that the quality of our relationships is based on the quality of our conversations. So having confidence to engage in difficult interactions is going to be able to change the trajectory and that outcome of the conversation. Helping you understand what is at stake for yourself and for others in the place of unresolved conflict is really important in order for us to reset how it is that we approach it. So today we're going to spend some time understanding what happens to our brain during conflict, because really we're all more alike than we're different. And we're going to share with you some solution-based approaches that will help support you in responding effectively to the conflict that you experience in your life. So what I'd like to do is just share with you at this time a little dilemma, and it's probably a dilemma that most of us experience in the workplace quite commonly. So I'm going to invite you to listen with your good listening ears. I'm going to share a little scenario for you, and we're going to check in with you after about what your reactions and thoughts are to this story. So Julia is faced with a dilemma. She finds herself responsible for leading a project based on direction given by her manager. And while this was going to be a stretch assignment for Julia, she started out very excited. But as time went on, she found herself increasingly stressed out. One of the key stakeholders she was supposed to be working with, Jana, was very resistant to the project. According to Jana and the direction that Jana had received from her boss, Julia's project was not deemed a priority, and as a result, Julia couldn't get the cooperation she was looking for. Jana said that her team was completely overloaded with other projects, and she didn't have the capacity to support that which Julia was looking for. So Julia became very frustrated. She continued to get pushback from her own boss, who told her that she needed to find a way to get this project off the ground and that she needed to flex her influencing skills to be able to get more people involved. Well, there Julia was one day at lunch talking with her friend Chris about the challenges that she was facing with the project. And Chris felt that it really wouldn't take too much effort for him to actually help Julia out, so he kindly offered his support. What a great guy. Julia was so grateful, and she found her excitement was rebuilding relative to the project. She was going to get some momentum moving on the project, and she was looking forward to updating her boss to be able to share some really great news. As it turns out, Chris was able to get Julia the first batch of information she needed in less than a day. She was elated. And with this new progress, she started to move forward with scheduling meetings that would involve other stakeholders. Well, that night, she received a scathing email from Jana. Jana was very upset that Julia had approached a member of her team, Chris, after she had expressly mentioned that this was not a priority for her group. Instantly, Julia's heart started to race as she read the email. And then she noticed that Jana had copied her own boss, Chris, and Julia's boss. Well, she suddenly felt very sick to her stomach. She had no idea how this got so out of hand. And she was also very angry that Jana had been so unprofessional to handle the situation in this way. She even became upset that Chris somehow had gotten her into trouble. She really felt under attack on a personal level. Her reputation now was at stake. She really needed to resolve this conflict. Any of you experience some of this in the workplace? What are some of the reactions that you have to this story? Feel free to type it into the chat panel so we can check in with you on what your thoughts are.
So we do have the chat panel open. You can select the option, everyone, to reply or send to all panelists, and that way we'll be able to see your responses. But I'm sure that there are many of you who can relate to the feelings that Julia is experiencing, both as she's gone engaged in this conflict and also her reactions to a conflict ensuing with her based on the email that she received. So some people commenting, Catherine, yes, the scenario sounds very familiar. They have experienced it before. There's a feeling of helplessness. Somebody commenting that they really dislike the surprise CC carbon copy to their boss. So it sounds like there's a lot of people who have experienced similar scenarios before.
Yeah, it's really something, isn't it? I mean, we know that these things happen oftentimes. So I guess the good news is in spite of the fact that it can be a challenging dilemma, we're no strangers to it, and we share a lot more in common than probably we share differently. A lot of heated emotion gets involved in these kinds of scenarios as well. You know, I listen to a lot of the emotional words that come out about, you know, words that kind of drain our energy, words like stress and pressure, frustration, you know, feeling angry or embarrassed or attacked. So everyone in this dilemma certainly has a level of emotional reaction that's very, very much connected to what's going on in their world, in their workplace. You know, and then you think about how do you ever really get to achieve goals when you've got all of this, you know, emotion happening in the workplace. I just want to share very briefly with you a quote that I love from Dale Carnegie, where he says we're creatures of emotion long before we're creatures of logic. And so as we move through the space, we know that conflict can very much bring with it emotional reactions, when really what we're looking for is emotional responses. So anything else that we're noticing out there? It's interesting. I was just working with some teams last week when we're not talking to one another and we're starting to jump to conclusions. Things tend to escalate, and they tend to really get in our way of being able to achieve what we're seeking to achieve. Mostly we want to be able to find ways to collaborate together, to work together, and to feel good about what we contribute in the workplace. And increasingly in this world of changing times and stress and overwhelm, it would seem that when we are triggered emotionally that we don't always bring our best selves to the table. So let's define a little bit about this definition of conflict. So, the textbook definition is really about coming into a collision with, that sounds painful, or a disagreement with, to really be perhaps in a controversial kind of a place, to quarrel even, to be at odds or in contradiction with one another, which is a really challenging place to come from. So, when we think about how it shows up in the workplace, I mean, not unlike what we just talked about with the case of Julia, Jana, and Chris, I mean, we oftentimes have competing priorities and competing resources or decreasing resources. We're having to do more with less. Perhaps it's about personality styles, right? We're all very different. And we also know that there can be plenty of miscommunication and misunderstanding that can also get in the way of being able to be effective in terms of managing conflict. Ultimately, then, there's more barriers to being successful, and it really puts us into this place of siloed communication. And we know being in siloed communication really isn't about being in communication at all. So, wouldn't it be great if we could bring that better version of ourselves to the conversation? And so, thinking about how often we're facing conflict out there, it's time to move on and check in with all of you out there. You're sharing with me familiar experiences that you have in the workplace. So let's just hear from you now. Christina, can you review with us the instructions on this poll?
Yeah, so we are going to open up a poll that will pop up on the right-hand side of your screen. So we'll ask you to just take a moment to reflect on these 3 questions. So first is, how often do you find yourself faced with conflict at work? The second is to get a sense of who else is involved in the conflict. I'm sure there's probably a need for an all-of-the-above option, but also really curious to know about what the impact is. And Catherine, just as we're continuing on the chat comments coming in related to the dilemma, one participant, Brandon, indicated that it sounds like a story that he has been a part of before, and that it seems like scenarios like this can really get blown out of proportion. And I just found that an interesting frame of reference, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about what triggers us to end up with situations that get blown out of proportion.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it really, it can happen so easily, can't it? And so we're going to really help point out what some of those triggers might be and what happens to us, but more importantly, what we get to do to find our way out of it in a way that's going to serve us and others at a higher level. It's really great to know that we're all kind of experiencing these things. The funny thing is we don't oftentimes talk about it either. We all know when the elephant's in the room, but we don't oftentimes approach it. And, coming back to, we don't really know how to manage it effectively. So we kind of leave it by the wayside, which actually doesn't support any different or higher level outcomes.
So, Jess, we can go ahead and close out the poll just so that we'll be able to see the results that have come in. There were some people, too, Catherine, commenting about the dilemma, saying that they were getting stressed out just hearing about it because they've had similar experiences. So it's amazing that immediate emotional reaction that we can get.
Well, and the thing of it is everyone around us, really, conflict can be triggered by a whole host of different things, can't it? But it's our perception of what that is, too, that's really important for us to pay attention to.
Definitely. So in terms of the results, Catherine, for how often you find yourself faced with conflict at work, looks like the majority of people on the line are indicating the answer D, occasionally, but then 32% follow it weekly. In terms of who's involved in the conflict, it seems to be most often with their colleagues. And all of the above is the answer in terms of the impacts. The stress goes up, relationships, motivation suffers. We can see all of the downsides of not resolving and responding to conflict.
Yeah. Well, and great that everyone's here today to be able to find some new ways to be able to manage that effectively. We definitely know that the people that we're working with right alongside are going to be the ones that tend to trigger us. But I guess, the big piece we want to think about is, when we understand how much a conflict that we're experiencing in the workplace and that sort of negative impact of it, wouldn't it be great if we could just maybe take a closer look at the sources of conflict and what's actually happening to us as we are faced with that conflict? I do a lot of work in resilience, and when we talk about being resilient, it's about really starting to understand these sources of conflict and knowing that, hey, guess what? These things are out there pretty much all of the time. The situations, the events, the people, the circumstances can all be sources of conflict, but it's what we choose to do with those sources of conflict that will either drive our stress levels up or help us, shift and change to a different kind of an outcome. There's a variety of factors that are out there in terms of stressors. It's funny, my husband gives me permission to use him in all of the speaking that I do and the workshops that I do. He used to always say, wow, you really push my buttons. And I said, well, that's really fascinating because it's a choice to have our buttons pushed or not. So paying attention to the factors that are actually out there that would trigger us to behave a little bit differently or to avoid conflict or actually engage in conflict is really important for us to pay attention to. There can be differences of opinion, right? Doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. We just have different ways of seeing things. We know that everyone's not like us, and that can rub us sometimes in the wrong way. We know that we can overreact or react in ways that have us losing our cool or other people losing their cool, which can oftentimes really escalate the situation at hand. Miscommunication and misunderstandings, oh gosh, we know that those happen almost all of the time, right? That's got to be one of the most difficult things to deal with, especially when we have these filters of our own fears and our own perceptions about what we think is happening, coupled with our own experiences. These all act as filters in the situations or the conversations that we do or do not have with people. And consider this huge, huge piece, trust. If we don't trust the people that we're working with, or we feel that we've been burned before, or perhaps that we have burned others, building trust is really, really difficult, right? We can break it very easily, but the rebuilding of it is very, very tricky. Think about the stress from those competing priorities. That can bring up a real fear response in us. A lot of us are sort of living in this water of fear and worry and concern. There's also past experiences, and this is really, really important. We talk about this as being the automatic assumptions or the automatic place we go before we even start to have a conversation with that other person. There's a lot of scar tissue, perhaps, that's left behind from a past poor experience with that individual. So we've already painted a picture and we've already created the scenario about how the outcome is going to be even before we have the conversation. It makes it really challenging to be able to reset ourselves to be able to come fully present and aware in order to overcome this. So, when we think back to the dilemma of Julia and Jana and Chris, you could all relate to that very easily, and you could see the different kinds of factors that are at play, which are really no different for any of us. So think about what happens now when conflict shows up in situations, events, people, past experiences, misunderstandings. It literally triggers a threat response where our brains are actually shut down from their ability to think clearly. I'm going to talk more about this physiological situation in just a moment, but imagine, if you will, what does it feel like when you are under threat? What does your body start to feel like? What happens to your heart? Does it race? Your breathing starts to change. Perhaps you are breathing more quickly and at a shallow pace. The stomach turns. The muscles get tight. I mean, we literally start to feel it in our physical being. And we know that this is the beginning of that physiological and the psychological response that literally closes down the thinking brain. So let's take a look at a little bit of neuroscience. I really love this part, and we live in such a great, interesting time where there's increasingly more information about how our brains work. Many of you may not realize that we actually have a three-part brain. Each of these brains is symbolic of our evolution as a species. And so harken back to about 2.5 million years ago, the Stone Age, the Paleolithic era, where the reptilian brain was the first brain to help us with our primal instinct of fight or flight, right? That instinctual brain really keeping us alive. The next brain to develop is the mammalian brain, also known as the limbic brain, and this is where our emotions reside. This will trigger the responses that we know as our emotional experience, right? The joy, the sadness, the pleasure, the anger, frustration, that breadth and depth of our emotional experience. And boy, these emotions are really valuable clues to what we need to pay attention to. And then we have the primate brain, the most recently evolved brain, the higher level executive thinking brain, where we do all of that logical thinking, the brilliant problem solving, our informed decision making, our ability to have foresight, the creative thinking. All of this takes place in the primate brain, in that neocortex, and that's what distinguishes us from other mammals. So why is this important? Well, based on what we've shared here, you can well imagine that when we are faced with conflict, when we are being triggered and we have a threat in front of us, we would really want the primate brain to come along for the ride, right? The primate brain that's calm and rational, but it's actually the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, and the reptilian brain, that instinctual brain, that actually takes the lead. So fascinating. Some of you may have heard the term threat response or amygdala hijack. So the amygdala is a small region of the brain that's located in the limbic system, in the mammalian brain, and it has a big impact. So when you either have or observe a severe or an intense emotional reaction, or could I offer maybe an overreaction, that is the amygdala hijack in action. Maybe some of you have toddlers in the house who have a temper tantrum. Maybe you have someone in the workplace that has lost their cool and they've raised their voice, or they slammed their hand on the table, or they got up and they walked out of the room, right? That is the sign of an amygdala hijack in action, and that is a signal that those emotions are taking over. We also call the amygdala the brain bandit, because what it does is it draws on resources from our primate brain, that higher level thinking brain, in order to assess the threat and react. It's an instinct that was designed to protect us. You've heard the saber-toothed tiger analogy before, right? If there's a threat out there, I'm either going to move to get away from it, I'm going to fight it. So what's really fascinating about it, our brilliant brains are expertly trained to actually maximize reward and to minimize threat. So think about that. And Christina, I'm going to get you maybe to jump to the next slide for me, if you don't mind. Yeah, that's great. Our brains want to move us in the direction towards things that actually feel good and to minimize threat, to move us away from things that don't feel good. And this instinctual response is really designed to protect our physical safety. And it's now also evolved to protect our social safety. But what it isn't really well trained to do is assess the degree of the threat, i.e. life or death, right? In fact, social scientists tell us that the brain cannot really differentiate between a perceived threat and a real threat. So standing up in front of an audience, maybe delivering, a webinar across the country, that could be perceived as threatening. I know my palms started to sweat before I came to the call. I was feeling a little bit of nervousness, but it engaged me to move forward because I love doing this kind of work. But I imagine getting in front of a boardroom, board of directors, to present my budget, and thinking it's not going to go well based on the last time it didn't go well. So that perceived threat versus the real threat. The idea is if we can increase our awareness around what those triggers are, practice some new strategies and ways of being, we're actually capable of rewiring the brain, right? And you're actually capable then of creating a different kind of a pathway with different outcomes. We're all capable of maintaining composure, self-awareness, and self-management. But it does take time, and it does take patience, and it does take practice. So we all have a natural reaction to conflict. When you're faced with conflict, do you fight, right? Do you want to get aggressive? Do you engage in, overly ambitious debate? Do you yell? Maybe do you appear hostile and express feelings at the expense of others? Perhaps you choose the flight response, the avoidance response. Maybe you don't express feelings in the moment, which leads to frustration, disappointment, or resentment after the fact. Maybe you ignore your own needs by moving away, right, minimizing the threat. Or perhaps some of us freeze. We may become overwhelmed by the physiological response, and we just completely lose our ability to think clearly, to be able to choose our words and choose our tone, to be able to choose something that would have been a better way to state it or to be able to behave in that situation. There can be a lot of regret that can happen in this place. And maybe some of us have a little more awareness, and we've really practiced this a little bit, and we're able to actually stay calm and express what we're feeling in a way that is not debilitating to the other. We're able to stand up for what we feel, what we think, what we believe, while holding the same is true for the other. And we understand and we own what our contribution is to the conflict. Those triggers are always out there for us, but before we get to move to a place of either discerning reaction or response, we need to create a pause, the pause place. I would say praise the pause, because there's a lot of choice that's available to us when we're able to sort of create a pause between stimulus and response. So it's time for another poll. We're really curious to see where it is that you place yourself on the spectrum of conflict responses. Christina, can you share with us again those instructions?
Yeah, so the poll is open on the right-hand side of your screen so that you'll be able to respond to which best describes your immediate and instinctual response when faced with the conflict. I do want to mention, speaking of amygdala hijacks, actually, that I mentioned at the beginning of the session that there might have been standing room only in a virtual event. So we did have a number of participants who were struggling to get into the room, which has since been resolved. But for those of you who are listening now, just a reminder, you will get access to a recording of today's session with the full duration of the event, so you'll have access to the visual of the slides for what you may have missed and the continuation on for the balance. So just a reminder that you will get a recording a couple days after today's session. And Jess, if we could go ahead and close out the poll to see what best describes those of you who are on the line today with your response to conflict or how you may instinctually react. So it looks like those results are just tabulating. I know for me sometimes, Catherine, it might vary depending on the situation, but I'd probably group myself into avoidance, I think.
Yeah.
I feel like
and isn't that true? It can be very situational, can't it? It can be situational. The other thing, too, that's interesting is it may not just be one of those things, but it could be a combination of those things as well.
Yeah.
So it's really important. Sorry?
Looks like I'm in the minority in terms of fight, but we've got 31% who said that they will respond to conflict, 29% indicating that they freeze, 20% indicating fight, and 18 are in flight.
Wow, so that's great. Yeah, well, that's fascinating, and it's an interesting distribution for sure. It looks like we've got a good level of awareness about how it is that we're managing the conflict. So that's a great opportunity for us now to talk about some of the strategies that might support you based on which of these areas is particularly resonant for you. So there's 5 strategies that we're going to talk about, and each of the strategies are going to be able to really support us in going from that reaction place to that response place, because ultimately, aren't we looking to become more productive in the way that it is that we communicate and connect with others. So the first one that we want to talk about, and this, for 20% of you that are in the fight place, 18% in flight, and 29% in freeze, there's an opportunity here for us to just start with regaining composure. That is job number one. And by regaining composure, we really mean how can we find a way to quickly re-engage that primate brain that has been tossed off to the side. And we know that at a physiological level, taking just a few deep breaths and getting oxygen back into our system is actually going to help to counteract the cascade of biochemicals, about 1,400 of them, that get triggered when we're under stress. And when you think about the top two of them, right, well, cortisol comes out as one of the very, very high hormones that kick into the gear. And, of course, they're there to help us be able to move into action and do what we need to do, but we probably don't need it living in our bodies for a long time. So resisting the urge to react emotionally is something that is going to be very supportive for us over the long term and help us deal more productively. Think about when people are upset, just take a few deep breaths. If you were to take 5 deeper breaths, cycles of breath, deeper, slower, more broadly than you normally would, you're already going to start to recalibrate your system and start to be able to access a little bit more of that clear thinking brain in the primate brain. And what that will allow us to do then is to be able to sit back and actually more effectively assess the situation. This is where we get to actually have a bit more of a reality check. What's really at stake here? Or what is the status of the relationship with the person that I'm frustrated with, or perhaps who's frustrated with me? And, we oftentimes would think not only can you do the breath, but you can step back and just sort of ask yourself, what do I need to do to sort of collect myself here, or even articulate that to the other? I'm just feeling a little out of sorts. I just need a few moments to just collect my thoughts before we re-engage in this conversation. There's that place where we can create the pause and create space to regain the composure and really effectively reassess what's going on. And let's move into our second strategy, which is around depersonalizing the impact. So it's pretty easy when we're engaged in conflict and when we're really emotional to take what's being said or done very personally, and it's easy for us to be able to put that out there as well. Sometimes we say and do things that we don't intend to, and then we have a great degree of regret after the fact. So we would encourage you in these moments to, in order to depersonalize the impact, just recognize that this isn't really happening to you, but it is actually happening, right? And so much of what actually escalates the conflict comes from what we've actually manufactured in our own mind. So getting back to the facts of the situation so you can understand what's happening is a place that we really need to go. And the other piece we want you to think about is, how could you reframe your thinking to actually assume positive intent from the other party? Sometimes we just really want to win, or sometimes we just want to be right. And at the height of a conflict, we kind of go into that self-protection mode, which is that threat response mode. And you oftentimes hear people saying, well, look, people don't always remember what they said, but they'll always remember how you made them feel. So if you were needing to be right because you were protecting your perspective, what's the impact to the other person? Bringing them closer together, pushing them further away. This really helps us to align to a higher purpose, to be able to communicate and collaborate with the other person that we really need to be on board with. So assuming positive intent is a really powerful strategy. And so let me just add to that, too. If any of you are looking for language that you could share in the moment, it doesn't hurt to actually say something to the effect of, Julia, it looks like I may have said or done something that's upset you. Or I'm really concerned that maybe I've done something to upset you. That can really start to depersonalize what's going on out there, not only for you, but for the other as well. Third, I really love this one, and this is such a coaching sort of approach to responding to conflict where you can dig deeper and actually suspend judgment. So when we start to get curious about what's happening over there for the other person and what concerns that they may have, it's a great opportunity for you to be able to dig a little deeper and hold back your judgment. Start to understand what's happening for them over there with more open-ended kinds of questions. You know, Julia, could you help me understand what happened here between us? What about the situation is most concerning for you? Would you be willing to share the impact that this situation with Chris had on you? Are you open to hearing a little bit about my perspective? I'm curious, what's led you to that conclusion? So we start to occupy this place of curiosity, which actually starts to engage people in a conversational mode. And the people who are asking the questions are actually the people who are in charge of the conversation. But a big piece about asking questions is that you are also willing to listen to the responses. We know that oftentimes when we're actually listening with the intent to reply. Here we're encouraging you to dig deeper with curious questions and then really listen, I would say, with an open heart and an open mind. And one tip before we leave this section is be very mindful of how your questions start. Be very, very cautious with the questions that start with the why. Starting the question with why? Why did you do that? Why did you react that way? Why are you so angry? Those kinds of questions actually put up the threat response in another, and they trigger defensiveness and an emotional reaction. Because we know that if we are questioned on the why, we will seek to defend ourselves because we likely feel quite attacked. So be mindful of the style of questions that you're asking. You know, I think this place of suspending judgment, because we're curious and because we're open-minded, we're listening without judgment, it links quite beautifully into this next piece called empathy and vulnerability. I think it's what the world could be. Yeah?
But before we jump ahead to empathy and vulnerability, one participant has asked just about, you know, what do you do if someone is out of control? So the person that you're engaged in the conflict with might be having an amygdala hijack and is emotionally responding and maybe showing, you know, a clear physical signs that they are out of control. You know, clearly you wouldn't move in to dig deeper at that point. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, you know, it's really, and what a great question. You know, it's really about being able to sort of regain some composure. And, you know, part of what I would be encouraging you to do is to be able to certainly regain your own composure, but create the pause in that moment and invite the other just to say, you know, it looks like I may have done something to upset you here, or it looks like something is really going on that maybe we just need to take a short break from. So it can really cause, you know, there to be a bit of a pause and stop the escalation of that amygdala hijack, because we know that when that reptilian brain is engaged, you just don't get to have a conversation with the rational brain or with the rational person. So, you know, in recognizing it, and good for you for seeing it in action with another, it now is really about creating the space so that you and the other can go back and start to recalibrate and regain composure. It's in that place that we're going to be able to see things just a little more clearly.
So in that moment, I guess in that moment, the suggestion would be to, you know, not necessarily start asking more questions, but it could be, I think we're both, you know, really upset right now.
Yeah.
Would it be all right with you if we just take a few minutes to collect ourselves and then come back together? Like that would really be the only question you'd want to put forward before you can speak for.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know, this is about really being present and seeing what's happening, not only for you, but for the other person. And, you know, here's the other thing, too. We might not always get it right. You know, we might not always get it right, but there's always the opportunity then to recalibrate from that. You know, there's always the opportunity to say, hey, things are not going quite as I had anticipated at this moment. Like you said, Christina, let's just take a few minutes to sort of regroup, or, you know, just to step back just a little bit, and maybe we can come back together tomorrow, or maybe we can come back together when clearer heads prevail. Because I know we're both wanting the best outcomes here, And I feel like it would be time for us just to take a little bit of a break from each other. So thank you for that, because you're right. I mean, you don't move sort of through first strategy, second strategy, third strategy. We need to really dance with what's showing up in the moment, and we need to be able to practice, sort of one of these emotional intelligence pieces around impulse control. It's really about noticing when the emotion comes up for ourselves and others, and then being able to practice that sort of self-management or that social management, managing the relationship of another when maybe they're not able to manage themselves. So we can really take the lead and show them maybe a bit of a different pathway. Okay. Well, and that was a great question. But, here's one of the things I think that might also assist you is on the topic of empathy and vulnerability. So this is a really powerful skill to practice, and it is very counterintuitive to the triggered threat response. Because when you can see that somebody else is really struggling with something or, is heated to overload there when it comes to their emotions, you can see their behaviors are at play, and you can see that there's inappropriateness there. But you can also maybe understand that they've got frustration or needs that are being unmet at this time, and maybe there's hurt feelings that are going on. So if we can see what's happening for another person and tap into that and try and understand their perspective and their feelings, this is a really great gift, I think, that we can give to another. And it really helps to take the heat out of a charged interaction, especially if you've got that going on with some scar tissue from the past. It gives us this wonderful opportunity to be able to also check in with and show our own vulnerability in the moment. Maybe it's an opportunity for us to also admit some of our mistakes or even put out some of our own fears or concerns that might be at play. Being vulnerable takes a great deal of courage, and it can feel pretty darn risky. But sometimes offering that out to another person actually is a real demonstration of your character and this willingness for you to sort of take accountability in that moment for your feelings, right? Oh, yeah, for our feelings and for what's going on for the other. I think I just saw a question pop up around the topic of bullying. Christina, do you see that question that just popped up? I can't seem to access it at this moment.
Yeah, I don't see it yet, Catherine, but I'll keep an eye out for it.
Okay, that sounds great. I guess, the piece is when people are ready to do battle and they're ready to be very aggressive, you can really take the steam out of it by just saying, it looks like there's something that's really upsetting you here, or it looks like you're really frustrated with what's going on. Mostly human beings just want to be seen, and we want to be heard, and we want to be valued by others. We want to know that we matter. And if someone can see what's going on for us, it can actually start to open up and take the heat out or neutralize what's going on. It's almost like sort of creating that olive branch, if you will, for us to be able to have a different kind of a conversation. Things that you could consider in the moment would be something like, it looks like you're feeling really frustrated. I really want to understand what we can do to find a better way forward. Or, perhaps there's something that I said that didn't quite land on you the way I intended it. It had an unintentional impact on you, and I'm sorry for what's happening. Could we maybe talk a little bit about that at this moment? So, when we sort of sit back and we offer some empathy and we name, I guess, the elephant in the room, it really helps people to see a new pathway to the conversation. It's really that first opportunity to sort of neutralize the heat. Mm-hmm.
So I have found that question, Catherine, and it was just asking that, if you're dealing with somebody who might be a bully at work, maybe a little bit more dominant or aggressive, the thought that maybe showing that vulnerability might not be as wise of a strategy that is a perception here, but in fact vulnerability might actually help to disarm or neutralize that other individual.
Yeah, what's interesting is, and certainly we see lots of this kind of behavior as well, usually people that are overly aggressive and confrontational Oftentimes they can come from a position of a positional authority, but usually what we find is people that are hijacked themselves and they really don't have that level of awareness, and they're only doing what it is that they know how to do. And typically what happens after the fact is they too feel regret for their behavior, but they don't know how to address it differently, so they just don't. And they don't then say after the fact what needs to be said. And so that scar tissue continues to build. And when I look at what's happening in the world these days with the significant amount of stress and overwhelm that exists in our personal and our professional lives, people are not bringing their best selves to the conversation, but they don't know the pathway. And now that we know the pathway, right, I guarantee you, as scary as it feels to try a little bit of empathy in that situation, I'll tell you it is an amazingly powerful gift that you can give to the other person and to the conversation. But someone has to be a little bit vulnerable and willing to go first. So perhaps it's just simply at that point in time about just saying, you know what, it looks like this is really important for you, and there's really something going on that we need to talk about. I can see that we need to be able to work through this. Perhaps we can regroup tomorrow, right? Going back to that opportunity to regain composure for both of you. And that shows real leadership when someone else can't find their way out of that difficult situation. I think it will be time for us to move on to the last strategy we want to share with you, which would be about collaboration. And certainly there's going to be a time and a place to do this. This is really once we've probably been able to sort of de-escalate what's going on, and this could be over a series of conversations or over a series of time as you work to regain the relationship. But collaboration is such a powerful force. Most people desire to contribute and collaborate in workforces to come to that better level outcome and those better solutions. I mean, hey, it just feels better, doesn't it, at the end of the day, to know that we could work together? And we know that conflict gets the reputation for, being really destructive, when in fact it can be both constructive and productive when everyone's willing to sort of understand what everyone else brings to the table, right? So we can preserve the relationship, we can grow the relationship, and we can focus in on the best interests of whatever it is, the team, the project, the organization, the senior leader, the junior on the team. So showing your desire to move forward and put the past behind you, that takes some practice as well. That means letting go of some of that scar tissue that we bring into the conversation. And it's about reframing the approach, right? When we come with the perspective around I win, you win, we all win, it really is about finding a solution or a way forward that's going to work for everyone, because now we're going to be on the same starting block where there's a little bit more honesty, a little bit more commitment, a little bit more opportunity to invite more of the voices to the table. We know, of course, that when trust is low, people are going to hold those things back. We're not going to be willing to be vulnerable, to our participants' point earlier, to share those opinions and feelings. And so, rebuilding the trust is really an essential component to responding to conflict productively and moving forward collaboratively. It's kind of this information loop that supports us in creating plans for the future and really creating the right climate for the dialogue. So if we think about our dilemma with our friends Julia and Jana and Chris, Julia probably could have done some things that would have helped her reduce her amygdala hijack. And she could have probably seen it, how it was happening in others as well. Maybe they could have worked to neutralize the situation. So for Julia, she could have depersonalized the situation. She could have dug a little bit deeper to understand Jana's concerns, so she would have been in a better position to ask for collaboration. And before she even considers responding to that inflammatory email that she received that evening, right, she would have needed to step back and gain some composure and really assess the situation from a calmer perspective. It sounds like she could have also depersonalized that impact of Chris, quote unquote, getting her into trouble, because she really didn't understand what the context was of how he actually shared the information with Jana. So there she was under all the stress, the pressure, the frustration, the anger, and feeling attacked, and she moved into the threat response when she would have had some other really powerful strategies she could have used. Think about Jana. You know, here's Jana who's overloaded and upset and frustrated and now feels like somebody's done an end run around her. Or perhaps she could have also dug in a bit deeper to understand what was going on for Julia, to get curious about what Julia's needs were instead of just shutting it down and saying no, perhaps coming with a little bit more, empathy and a desire to understand more about the situation and what Julia needed. She could have maybe taken a different approach other than email, which, gee, if we're not willing to sort of say it face-to-face, we ought not be doing it via other means. That email really caused it to inflame even greater. And perhaps before she even pressed send on the email, a few deep breaths or some time in between the trigger and her reaction would have served her well. Showing empathy to her needs and open up the opportunity to share concerns and priorities would have also been something that would have been very beneficial in this case. And then consider Chris. Boy, this is a guy who just wanted to be helpful, and he somehow landed right smack dab in the middle of what was going on between Julia and Jana. Chris may have this opportunity to do some damage control to actually preserve the relationship that he has with both of those ladies. Maybe Chris can show a little bit of empathy and a little bit of vulnerability because he can maybe see what's going on for both of them. And perhaps he can also dig in a little bit deeper to see how he may have inadvertently played into the situation. He came with good intentions, but he landed into an ongoing conflict. And now he really needs to be able to sort of stay the course, remain calm, and understand all of the perspectives around him in order to successfully navigate his way to a better outcome, if you will. So I think, these strategies can be used in tandem over the course of time. Can certainly be very situational, but they're worth paying attention to, so that regaining of composure and being able to assess the situation from a place where your brain is functioning with clarity, to depersonalize the impact of what's going on, to spend some time with curious questions, digging deeper, seeking first to understand, and withholding the judgment or assumption that we automatically jump to bring some empathy and some vulnerability when it's appropriate, and to challenge yourself to do it when you feel scared to do it. That's likely the time that it's really called for. And to be in the place where you can ask for collaboration, where it's appropriate. These strategies are really intended to help you reframe your mindset when you're going into these conversations, because this is really about having a breakthrough, isn't it, rather than a breakdown. Reframing our mindset when we're on conflict really sets us up to approach the individual and the conversation in a way that's completely different and far more productive than maybe we've been doing in the past.
So this ends the rebroadcast portion of our webinar. My name is Tanya Trivoni. I'm with the Canadian Management Center, and I'm here to facilitate a live Q&A for today's session. So if you haven't submitted a question in the chat panel and you'd like to, please go ahead and do that now. I did notice that we had a couple questions come in, so thank you to Kingsley, who asks, how long must it take for someone to regain their composure? So I don't think this is so much a question of the amount of time. This really comes down to being aware of your own body and your physiological responses. So if you're talking about yourself, how long does it take for you to gain composure? When you're in those conflict situations, if you're noticing your palms sweating, if you're noticing shortness of breath, if you're noticing that freeze or flight response, then clearly you're not calm. So it's taking those deep breaths, regaining that composure just so that you can assess the situation and not automatically react. So again, it's more about understanding yourself, and then when it comes to someone else, it's a little harder to tell what's going on in their in their physiology, but looking for obviously raised voices or body language, giving time for either party, both parties rather, to regain composure. So another question is coming in. Oh, there's lots of questions coming in here in the chat panel. There was a question from Kathy that says, what if the other person just simply does not listen? So here again, thinking of those 5 steps, you want to make sure that you come at this with empathy. When people are not listening or if they're getting defensive, it means that they're having their own amygdala hijack. They're having their own reaction. There's something that is feeling unsafe. So it is an opportunity to maybe ask a question and to clarify your intent. So one of the things that can make people feel safe is to reiterate your intention for the conversation. So if your intention is to get to a mutually beneficial place, if your intention is to have a better working relationship, this may be the time to restate your intention. It can also be a good time to comment on what you're observing. So this is where you may have to change the content of the conversation. So if you were talking about, an example of the stories that we heard, a project that people have conflicting priorities around resources, you may have to change the content to talk about what's happening in the situation. Now, you don't want to say, hey, I notice you're not listening to me. And so that gets to Catherine's point about don't say anything that's going to cause a bigger reaction or be judgmental, but it might be simply something like, is there something I've said that has shut down this conversation? I noticed you're not making eye contact, or I noticed what is it that you're noticing, and then recommit to getting back into the dialogue. So I would say, don't give up, but sometimes it does require you to shift the content of what you're saying. And then someone else is asking, when is it too late to address a conflict? You've had time to pause and reflect, and maybe weeks later want to revisit an interaction. So again, I'm not sure that there's a magic formula, but I wouldn't want to leave it too long, because in that space, both parties can be creating all kinds of stories and seeking all kinds of evidence to reinforce their side of the situation. So, if you want to give it a day, if you want to give it a few hours, obviously you have to figure that out. If you've now let it go that many weeks, I would argue it's never too late. But you might want to start from a vulnerable place and say, you know what, I've let this go too long because I've been uncomfortable. I don't want to further escalate this conversation. Why I'm coming back is because our relationship is important. I want to own my part of this, and I'd like to seek a better understanding. So I wouldn't give up, even if it has been weeks, but if you can be a little more proactive or not let it go that long, I think that would be a lot easier to facilitate. We are running out of time, so I don't want to skip this slide. Dealing with conflict, having more effective communications comes down to practicing the skills. So just so that you are aware, we have a number of options, 2-day and 1-day programs responding to conflict, strategies for improved communication, one of our most popular courses, as well as a shorter conflict management course, and another course called The Secret to Getting Through to Anyone. Those dates can be found on our website. Also on our website, you can find other resources, free resources related to this topic, whether it's around communication, leadership, management, all kinds of great stuff. Please check out cmcoutperform.com if you've not visited our site. And then finally, for those of you who are looking for PDU accreditation, know that the Canadian Management Centre is a registered education provider with PMI. So take a moment to jot down this information, and it will be in the recording that we'll be sending out, and this will help you more easily claim your PDU for this session. Finally, I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope you are taking away something of value, and please, at the end of this, do communicate with us. Let us know what other topics you'd like to hear about, and we hope you can join us on a future webcast. Have a great afternoon.